All right. So, since moving to Gunnison in the late 1980s, I've been repeatedly told that the Gunnison Valley is unique, that it is distinctive in some indefinable way. To provide just one example so you know what I'm talking about, from the institutional mission in Western's college catalog. Western's distinctive character emerges from its unity among academic and professional disciplines, its high standards of scholarship, and its unique environment in the mountains of Western Colorado. I've lived here for just a little over 24 years, and I think I understand why Gunnison's uniqueness, its distinctiveness might be indefinable. It's because, from a certain perspective, we're not particularly unique. At least, we're not unique in a way that makes us unlike any other mountain community in the world, in the Western Hemisphere, in the United States, in the Rocky Mountain region, even in the state of Colorado. We're not necessarily unique. Now, we are, of course, unique in the sense that no other community or area is exactly like us, but is there enough of that uniqueness to make the Gunnison Valley truly distinctive? Okay, so maybe you're thinking we don't need to worry about unique. Who cares if there's nothing particularly remarkable about the Gunnison area that deserves further study? Perhaps we just ramp up our marketing efforts to prospective residents, tourists, and to students interested in attending Western in an effort to persuade them to relocate to this area. A specific sense of place, a refined definition of what here means in the context of the Gunnison area might not be necessary. Except, in my opinion, it is necessary, because a superficial investigation of the region would lead most people to believe that there is no particular reason to locate here. So our region's survival depends on communicating to the rest of the world what makes us a place of value. Our region's survival also depends on knowing how we are interconnected with the rest of the world. And finally, our region's survival depends on understanding why we do what we do here, what actions we perform that are essential, and what kinds of spaces and spatial relationships are required for our actions to be successful. The study of place, the understanding of what constitutes here in our minds, is of great importance if we are to maintain a healthy society. In Gunnison, yeah, but everywhere else as well. People need to know where they are, how they got there, and what they're doing in their places, in what they call here. What I'd like to do this evening is look at this sense of place, at the notion of here, from the perspective of a trained practitioner in the discipline of theater and as a lifelong student in the study of performance studies. I'm going to focus on the Gunnison area because it's readily available to this audience. In most cases, you're going to understand my references and examples. I can't speak for the people that will be hearing this electronically. But there's always Google. And in order to meet the spirit of philosophy intersections, I'm going to add into the mix some observations on Martin Heidegger's essay, Building, Dwelling, Thinking from Poetry, Language, Thought, which I believe has some useful insights into the subject of this evening's talk. After that, I'm going to spend just a moment on the issue of dislocation, on those individuals and groups living among us who feel alienated or trapped within the boundaries of place set by a community. And finally, I'd like to leave the audience with some questions that I think are essential for any serious consideration of place. I am a theater person by training, interest, practice, and this is important, by perspective. In other words, I see the world through my training as a theater person. I believe a play is a performance, but that life can be viewed as a performance. Irving Goffman and others have written at length about the taking on of roles by individuals in everyday life, of becoming actors, if you will. And from the perspective of performance, from my perspective anyway, if there are actors in everyday life, then there also must be sacred spaces designated as stages or settings. In this light, Shakespeare's famous and overused line, "All the world's a stage," takes on a somewhat different meaning. The human world, in effect, consists of an array of stage sets. One might argue that stage sets are temporary and human constructions are built for permanence, but I would respond that the determination of what is temporary and what is permanent is simply a matter of time. All human building is temporary. Even the perception or understanding of a particular human building is temporary. One of the ideas that I would hope you would take away from tonight's talk is that our sense of place, anyone's sense of place or notion of here, is as transitory as the set of any theater production. We live our lives moving through stage settings. Okay, so what are the functions of a stage set, more recently of stage lighting and projections? Those are sort of kind of being into the mix now with the traditional stage sets. What service do they provide to a dramatic work, and more important, to an audience understanding and appreciating that work? Relevant to tonight's talk, I can think of four. First, to define the performance space as sacred. Two, to define a setting in which the dramatic work might acceptably take place. Three, to assist in controlling the focus of the audience. And four, to directly or indirectly provide information about A, the social and cultural context of the dramatic work, and B, the psychological, cultural, and spiritual underpinning of the characters and their actions. Typically, much thought and care is given to the synthesis, what the Germans call Gesamtkunstwerk, of these elements in all areas of theatrical production. But for the purpose of tonight's talk, we're going to focus on the establishment of place. And so I would ask, with respect to the elements just listed, how is, say, a community or a college campus any different than a stage set? The casual tourist passing through Gunnison, Crested Butte, Mount Crested Butte, and Pitkin will derive very different initial messages about what each community values, how it identifies itself, and what it considers important. I know this firsthand. 4 summers ago, I took my oldest brother and his youngest son on a tour of these 4 communities, and they came away. They were the ones that first put this into my mind. Boy, these are all mountain communities, and they're all really different. Okay, so we might have 4 different plays in the same performing art complex, if you know what I mean. When our local political leaders and editors of our community newspapers point out the common purpose binding together the residents of our region, it might do well to point out that the architecture, the spaces, and the buildings seem to suggest otherwise. The presentation of the region, both to its own residents and to its visitors, appears to lack synthesis. The illusion of a stage set, its ability to represent a world not real in a convincing manner that results in the willing suspension of disbelief of its audiences, also may be found in real-life communities. Again, a casual walk down the alleys in and around the business district in Gunnison will reveal very different structures than what one encounters passing by on the street. The best example of this is the Johnson Restaurant building, currently the home of Gunnison Gallery. You have a full, attractive 2-story rectangular front that conceals a far less appealing and dumpier structure that comprises the actual building. This is a good example of the architectural false front. Another example of theatrical staging of space involves the Board of Zoning and Architectural Review, the infamous Beaux-Arts in Crested Butte. In an attempt to create an architectural unity consistent with the designation of the town as a National Historical District, new buildings are made to look consistent with the traditional Victorian architecture found along much of Elk Avenue. Does that make the new buildings Victorian? And do the new buildings even look that Victorian? And finally, what makes the Victorian architecture along Elk Avenue unique or worth emulating? The mines didn't close until the 1950s. Why aren't the boxy homes free of ornamental frou-frou that were being built in the mid-20th century, why aren't they also being preserved? Why isn't this architecture being emulated by new construction and zoning boards? I would suspect the answer lies somewhere in the regions between romance and nostalgia. The appropriation of theatrical illusion and deception and the establishment of a sense of place is, of course, not unique to the Gunnison area. Earlier and more historic examples include, and I have to attribute this to Don Seastrom, who gave me this example, the cardboard Rome built to welcome Hitler when he traveled by train to visit Mussolini in 1938. Robert Hughes talks about that in his book, Rome. And earlier, the White City of the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. In both cases, apparently solid buildings of classical design proved to be made of plaster, lath, and paper products. There was a lot of talk, I'm more familiar with the Columbian Exposition, and there was a lot of talk about preserving the White City because it looked so good, and we really needed to do something. And if there was any doubt that this wasn't a real city, in 1894, the whole thing burned down. So that took care of that. But wait, there's more. Even the external objective realism, the physical truth of our mountains and valleys are morphed into an institutional reality through the use of some of the same principles employed by theater designers. A single physical reality is reframed and redesigned, in effect, made into a stage set to provide the setting for a uniquely human drama. So, is that single physical reality Mount Emmons, rich treasure trove of molybdenum, or is it the Red Lady, backdrop for a nuts and granola ski town? It all depends on one's dramaturgical perspective, how that scenic backdrop is designed. One word of caution before pushing this analogy too far. I don't mean to suggest that Mount Emmons / Red Lady is a completely passive object waiting for humans to mold it to their reality. It is dynamic, and it has its own kind of action that has nothing to do with human beings. But it is available for appropriation as a setting for human drama. All instances of human habitation have points of conflict when it comes to the definition of place. Were that not the case, I'd suggest we'd all still be hunting and gathering. But there are three factors that make the definition of place doubly difficult for those of us living in the 21st century. The first is that in most contemporary cultures, a number of the elements that comprise a here aren't an organic part of that here. Much of our food, clothing, shelter, fuel, and entertainment are all being produced elsewhere. As a result, we've imported much of what constitutes our sense of place and constructed a setting that is not authentic. We then mistake ourselves into believing that this place we've constructed out of alien parts is genuine. Now, talk about a willing suspension of disbelief. The second factor affecting the definition of here is that many of us not only live in a physical space, but are also staking out a claim in the land of hypertext. Through all sorts of electronic and digitally mediated communication, a person can cob together a stage set of his own liking and act out the illusion of living in a place on the internet or in front of the television or lose himself in online role-playing. If we don't like the drama unfolding in our physical place, we can lock the front door, turn out the lights, and retreat to our virtual reality. Or we can simply leave altogether and move somewhere else. The final factor that is making the definition of place problematic is our culture's mobility. The majority of individuals currently living in Gunnison County were born somewhere else. Many have lived in more than two places. What is more, several of the reasons why people locate to the Gunnison area have to do with temporary opportunity. They come here to snowboard, to attend college, for seasonal employment opportunities, but have no plans to make this place their home. Others reside here for only a part of the year and consider home to be someplace else. All of this can become a major problem when public policy issues related to the definition of place are discussed. One perceives a place very differently depending on whether they define it as home or the place that's other than home. To provide just one example, the visitor or part-time resident to our area may have their lenses colored by the romance of living in the Rocky Mountains. For them, the appropriate theatrical setting can be anything from the art of Albert Bierstadt or Frederick Remington, to the writing of anyone from Edward Abbey to Louis L'Amour, to an image of the West that really doesn't exist anywhere but in their own heads. And it is to this romantic destination that they escape when the realities of home become overwhelming. Now, on the other end of the spectrum is the homesteader descendant who frames their drama with the scenery of nostalgia, who longs for some Paleolithic lost garden from their reimagined youth or from the selective memory of an elder. For them, several generations of learned behavior and cultural perceptions may be threatened by even the slightest disruption. Sandwiched somewhere in between is a group who identify this place as home and who are eager to repaint the backdrop or modify the stage lighting, metaphorically speaking. When all of these parties show up in the county commissioner's chamber to discuss a public policy issue, the definition of place becomes a point of contention, and its resolution is ultimately one of utility or political expedience. So, how does a community go about establishing a sense of place that is authentic, useful, and allows for human growth? Well, for me, some possible ideas came from a reading of Martin Heidegger's essay, Building, Dwelling, Thinking. From a determination of the meanings and origins of the German words for building, dwelling, and thinking, Heidegger proceeds to identify human beings as dwellers. And as dwellers, we build. Everything that we build is for the purpose of dwelling. This is not to say that we live in a power plant or out on a bridge, maybe some people live under a bridge, even though both are human buildings, but that everything we build has to do with dwelling. And in order to dwell, we have to, as he says it, be set at peace. We have to feel safe. As Heidegger says, the fundamental character of dwelling is sparing and preserving. He suggests the adoption of something he calls the fourfold, which consists of the earth, the sky, the divinities, and the mortals. Now, I don't pretend to fully understand Heidegger. Few do. But his description of the fourfold made sense to me in the context of this discussion tonight. This is my interpretation. The sky provides us with light, precipitation, and all manner of weather. The earth provides us with sustenance and the resources required to build and to dwell. We want to take advantage of the gifts of both while at the same time protecting ourselves from their threats. Now, the idea of the divinities, as Heidegger describes them, is a bit unclear. But I interpret this third component of the fourfold as an articulation, perhaps. He does talk about it as the Godhead, but then I wasn't sure that I could reconcile that with what little I know of Heidegger. So I thought about it more as maybe the articulation of the ideal, or better, angels, if you will. Healthy human communities, they share certain ideals, and what we build and how we dwell is a reflection of those ideals. And finally, there is us, we humans who live and die in our place and gauge our life's worth from how successfully we preserve the earth and the degree to which we can establish a sense of safety and of being protected. Now, to me, if I understand Heidegger correctly, this seems a respectable standard for establishing a sense of place that will mark its uniqueness and usefulness. This examination of what is here must include a final, if troubling, caveat. Understanding the importance of place and how it provides us with a sense of preservation and safety is essential in helping to keep all of us sane. The complications in identifying our sense of place and coming up with a suitable stage setting on which any group can enact its cultural idea of here nearly always contributes to a sense of dislocation in certain members of a community who don't want to be a part of the play. The setting frightens them. They don't feel safe on this particular stage. They don't want to be in this play. And ultimately, a few can even grow isolated and delusional. It was one such person who, about a year ago, jarred me into considering this topic on which I speak this evening. Pima Community College is an innocuous-looking place. It appears to have been designed to be functional and somewhat welcoming. But to at least one resident of Pima County, it was an indoctrination center, an internment camp. He perceived it as a direct threat to his own well-being. He filmed himself walking through the campus, ruminating in an extremely disturbing and deranged way about the horrors taking place in the classrooms. And from the perspective of his video, which is, by the way, readily available on YouTube, Pima Community College almost began to resemble a nightmare dream by Hieronymus Bosch. A few months later, Jared Lee Loughner, the maker of this film, killed and wounded 18 people at a congressional meet and greet in a parking lot in Tucson. Loughner is one in a long line of individuals whose psychopathic fanaticism has left the American landscape littered with bodies, and I don't intend to claim that we will ever come up with a way to deal successfully with the unhinged. But I do believe there is a frontier, rather than a clearly demarcated border, that separates the pathological from the nonconformist and the eccentric, and from there it's only a short step to the rest of us. I'll leave you to figure that out. As such, the actions of people like Loughner may serve as canaries in the coal mine for the rest of us when it comes to cultural health. Might all of us, to some extent, suffer from some form of dislocation? Now, nothing like Loughner's, of course, but nevertheless troubling and contrary to the overall good health of a community. If, as Heidegger maintains, our dwelling should protect and preserve us, provide us with a sense of safety, what is to be done with those individuals who don't feel protected? Might the sense of dislocation result in loneliness, hostility, and a vulnerability to the more destructive forces of our species? Now, Dr. Terry Schliessman provided me with some information. It was too late to get into this today, but I'll slide it in now. This is a very big issue. A good example for the people in the room here tonight of what I'm talking about with dislocation is there is a high level of dislocation among entering first-year students in colleges and universities. It's a big problem. Okay, so this is not something, I wanted to root it to something fairly concrete for all of you. Okay, so it was announced last week by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, some of you may have read this, that as many as 1 in 5 Americans suffered from some form of mental illness in 2011. Now, that rather alarming figure could indicate that the definition of mental illness might have to be reassessed. But I also wonder if a number of these mental health cases might not be a result of people feeling alienated, unprotected, or not safe. I don't want to press the point too far, but it seems to me that physical and mental well-being must be a part of the discussion of place. So, in conclusion, because I want to leave time for conversation, I will leave the audience with the following questions to consider, and I believe they're essential to any discussion of place. How can those of us who are believers in place-based education reinforce the notion that any given here is a stage set designed by politics, utility, and myth thinking? That the notion of here is one that constantly is being negotiated and renegotiated among various members of a community, and that it is established primarily by people's actions. How do we define a here for a community inundated with satellite and cable television, computers, and cell phones? How do we define and understand a here that Heidegger may not have imagined, one that is virtual? Can there really be a here for communities when there is a significant transient population? Can there really be a here for communities that import most of their clothing, food, and furnishings, where new homes are built from plans drafted by architects in another city, and retail establishments and public structures are designed and built by out-of-towners with a relatively superficial understanding of the communities with which they are doing business, and where the predominance of our arts and entertainment originate from somewhere else? And finally, what do we do to minimize the sense of dislocation? What do we do with individuals who don't feel like they belong to a place or are disoriented in relation to that place, or worst of all, feel personally threatened by the prevailing sense of place?